Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As 1 o'clock is about to approach, we would like to welcome you to yet another session, sound learning session on Pelican Sound Guide to Fake Science. Real quick, a couple notes about housekeeping during this meeting, this webinar. At this point, you are going to be muted. Mr. Yoakum is going to be going on with his presentation very shortly, and we ask you to hold your questions until the end of the session. And once that's happened, I am going to release Paul. We would like to know how we did today on our presentation. Additionally, once you're going to be asking questions, you will be raising your hand. And once you do that, I will allow you to be unmuted and ask questions in real time. And without further ado, Mr. Yoakum, go ahead and take us to the world of the fakes of the science.
Okay, there are several items of business to take care of first. One of these is to thank Aga and Travis both for the efforts they put forward to keep sound learning going in this time of the pandemic. I'd also like to thank the audience for showing up for this presentation. And because we don't have coordinators in the Zoom format, the speakers get to introduce themselves. This has some dangerous possibilities to it, but I will keep this one pretty brief. I'm a retired university professor. I was on the faculty at the University of Michigan for 39 years, during which time I taught undergraduates and graduate students. I mentored a number of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows in a number of research projects. And the focus of my research, I guess you'd say it was molecular life sciences. The general thrust of what we were trying to do was to better understand, using the techniques of biochemistry and chemistry, to understand the reactions in photosynthesis that allow plants and algae to convert water into oxygen. So that's me. As part of a hobby, I guess, while I was on the faculty at Michigan and staying on even after that, I kind of began to collect oddball science. Some of it was outright fraud and cheating by scientists themselves, and some of it was fake science. And I often use the examples with my students as a way of showing them what they shouldn't do. They should stay on the straight and narrow and do real science. And so today I'm going to blend a little bit of material from some previous talks I've given with some new material so that you can get an idea of the range and reach of fake science. So I thought I'd start with a comment from one of my favorite American philosophers, Mark Twain. Mark Twain once said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble." That's sort of, ignorance is bliss. And today there's a lot more that you might not know that could get you into trouble. But it was the second thing he said, and that is, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. That I thought sounded a lot like what fake science is. You're going to see today people that thought they knew something for sure, absolutely for sure, actually, that just ain't so. So let me run you through some definitions fairly quickly. First of all, about science. I mean, you know what science is. It's a real thing. I mean, it's verified by observation, usually by a number of scientists, by the collection of data, by repeated experimentation, so that if you wandered into an area and you wanted to be sure something was right and you repeated an experiment the way it was reported to have been done, you'd get the same answer. And the answers are often very, very precise. And I do this in a nod to Ken Selger's talk about measurements. For example, people have measured the pull of gravity out to, they're about 5 places after the decimal point. We know the speed of light in terms of meters per second. If somebody wanted to go out and measure it again, they'd get that number if they followed all the rules. In the life sciences, you know that insulin injections protect diabetes patients, whether the insulin comes from the pancreatic tissue of dead animals, or if it's created by genetic engineering in a bacterium. And just about everybody, but not quite everybody, believes that bacteria and viruses cause diseases. So the germ theory of disease is on pretty solid grounds. And I think you all have examples yourselves that you could use on and on and on of the reality of true science. That's not the only kind of science. I had talked in another presentation about fraudulent science. This is data manipulation. The bad guys here are scientists themselves usually, but it only accounts for about 0.005 of 1% of all the scientific research in the world. And it's even less than that in the United States, because scientists in the United States are busy tracking down the evildoers and making sure they don't do it again. One example of this is where somebody does an experiment and they carry it out correctly, but they take the resulting data and change it in such a way as to produce a false result, usually a much more fantastic result that's designed to advance their careers. They get caught, they don't do it again. In the other case, an experiment can be rigged to produce a desired result that is absolutely false. In this case, it might be to change a temperature, to change the amount of acid, this, that, or the other thing in a particular experimental protocol, so that a new result comes out and something is done with that. So aside from fraudulent science, there's fake science. These are phenomena that are passed off as real science. They never have reliable supporting data in the end. And in many cases, when you hear about it, it strains believability. That possibly can't be true. I mean, it's really off the wall kinds of things. You usually get fake science from experts with no relevant expertise. For example, a motorcycle mechanic talking about heart transplant surgery, or scientists themselves. And I've got two examples for you today. Public figures, I hesitate to say it, but sometimes elected officials, for example, various other people will come up with something that's, well, fake. And then it gets passed along. And today we have all kinds of mechanisms for getting fake science out to the public. The media, I mean, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, radio, television, and what have you. And talk show hosts, they'll sometimes pick up somebody that's had a really wild story, put them on the air and let them talk about it, then it gets passed along that way. So there's no easy way to stop fake science. It moves right along. And in some cases, that's the last thing I wanted to say, is that fake science actually can get picked up and turned on and moved along from fraudulent science. So there are all kinds of ways to get into this. So today, here's an outline of what we're going to talk about. These are all truly fake. Emotional plants, a memory in water, a strange nutritional cult that believes that all you need is air and water to get along. And all three of these are out at the fringes. They're really nutsy stuff, and you'd be able to spot them a mile away. I want to focus a bit on vaccines and autism, because this is kind of serious business that has gone in ways that I don't think anybody predicted in the first case. Talk about autism and facilitation. You'll see what that is. And it's, again, something that had some harmful consequences. And finally, communist weed. I couldn't think of anything else that I could call this except communist weed, and you'll see what that is when we get to it. Okay, so well, here's Cleve Baxter. His real name was Grover Cleveland Baxter. And this picture of him comes from about 1968, when he was near the heyday of his fame for one of his career tracks. He had two career tracks, and I'll talk about both of them briefly. So the first career track involved this gadget that's on your left or his right that has all these knobs and buttons and everything on it. That's a polygraph, or a lie detector. And in his time from the mid-1950s well into the 1970s, Cleve Baxter was probably the most gifted and most accurate operator of lie detectors in the United States. He was so good that he managed to keep an office in New York City on Manhattan Island. He was under contract to the intelligence people, Central Intelligence Agency, because they had a lot of work for him. At the time, this was the Cold War, and going forward from that, a lot of people were escaping from behind the Iron Curtain, showing up in CIA offices eventually, with claims to have military secrets, diplomatic secrets, and so forth and so on. And the first stop for them was in Cleve Baxter's office in Manhattan, where he strapped on the electrodes and everything and ran the lie detector past them. And he actually said lie detectors weren't really lie detectors, they were truth detectors, because almost in every case that he dealt with, people wound up being cleared by the detector, and they were telling the truth. But he was so busy with this that he actually managed to generate enough capital to open a small university out in San Diego, and it was the Cleve Baxter School of Polygraph Operation. And he trained a whole generation of lie detector operators. And so he was, he's bona fide. He's the real thing. He's the genuine article in terms of lie detection. So he had a substantial career. He had quite a reputation. That's one career. Now, the second career you can see also, because in front of Mr. Baxter there, sitting on the lie detector, is a plant. And it looks like Mr. Baxter is about to put electrodes on that plant, which is exactly what he did. And that gets us into the other career of Cleve Baxter. Some of you may remember this, I don't know. It made quite a splash at the time. So what he did with these electrodes was to try and measure signals coming from the plants. It was a cane plant, Racini, I think is what it was called. And he detected signals. Well, that was neat to start with, but it got funnier than that. He actually threatened to set the plant on fire, he said, and the signals increased. He never said if they were signals from Baxter or signals from the plant, but he got more signals. And this led to a third set of experiments, if you want to call them that, where Baxter took living brine shrimp in a container of some sort, went into a separate room from where the plant was, where the plant was all hooked up to the lie detector, and he dumped the brine shrimp into the boiling water, and according to his reports, the plant's electrical signals increased. So all of this was reported in the newspapers, and it was in the New York Times, various other papers nationally, that this lie detector expert had actually used a lie detector to begin to establish that plants have emotions and that plants can, sense these things. And the worst of it was that on the result with the brine shrimp, he concluded that plants not only have the emotions, but they're also capable of extrasensory perception. So this is a time in the late 60s, early 70s, when ESP was kind of a fashionable thing. And he got a lot of traction out of this. He was on television shows, he was in the newspapers, and he really was riding high with the idea that plants were communicating, they were emotional, and they had a sensing system that nobody had ever detected before. Okay, well, this all ended up being written up in a book that came out in the early 1970s called Secret Life of Green Plants. And I actually saw a copy of this book. And sure enough, the first 50 pages or so were all dedicated to Cleve Baxter, the lie detector, and the signals from plants and the ESP and so forth and so on. I was more taken in that book with another story, which was about a bunch of amateur astronomers in Phoenix who went out in the desert, hooked up electrodes to saguaro cacti and to their telescopes, and were waiting for signals to come from aliens from outer space. Now, all of this, in retrospect, sitting here in 2021 is, of course, totally ridiculous. The downside is that finally people said, well, where's your evidence? Where are your results written down? I mean, how did you do the experiments? And he had no record to present on this. And in the end, his lie detector business prospered. His business with plant communication sort of withered and died off. One thing that drives me crazy to this day is that you can find Cleve Baxter, you can look him up, he's in Wikipedia. And Wikipedia, right at the top, it always gives the name and then it says what they are. And it says Cleve Baxter, and it says plant biologist. If Cleve Baxter is a plant biologist, the moon is made out of green cheese, I reassure you. So this pretty much has died off and gone away, except for one example, which I have to show you just in getting out of here. His discovery apparently has not been forgotten. This is from this is a recent interview that happened in England is Prince Charles. And Prince Charles, it turns out, he's an amateur gardener. He talks to his plants. And the quote, straight from the interview, is that he makes his garden grow by talking to the plants. I just come and talk to the plants. Really, very important to talk to them. They respond. Well, you can make of this what you want. I have my own private theory about this. It has something to do with why Queen Elizabeth has stayed on the throne so long, but you can figure out something for yourself if you want to. Okay, so this is a case where you had a polygraph operator, there's some technology involved in that, who got into biology in a big way and overstepped his bounds and got found out. The second case I want to talk to you about is Dr. Jacques Benaviste. He's a French scientist, and he claims that water had memory. So this is a very strange case in that Benaviste was a French scientist that had a super research career. In the life sciences area, he'd done a lot of very good work in immunology, say solid gold. And he was the director of a large French institute that dealt with allergic responses and with immunology. And if I were going to put him on a yardstick and kind of measure him against other people that you might know about, I would say that he was probably at the same level in the French research community as Anthony Fauci is here. Fauci heads an institute at the National Institutes of Health, and Benaviste had similar standing in France. So it's very strange what happened with Benaviste. Nobody, I think, to this day fully understands what happened with him. But suddenly, in this great research career of his, he took a hard left turn. He claimed that water retained a memory, that is a structure, that water had a structure that was that of an antibody from the immune system that had been dissolved in it. And I say, whoa, wait a minute, how do you do that? You do that by using Avogadro's number, and this is going to be the only heavy science in the whole talk. Avogadro's number is basically a number is 6.0224 times 10 to the 23rd, which is actually the number of molecules in a given amount of substance in a given solution of water. And if you know that number, and then you begin to dilute and dilute and dilute and dilute, you can obviously get it back down to where there's nothing left of what we had dissolved in the water. And that was his argument, that he had done this. And when he was done, he had this magic water that gave a result, a scientific result, where the behavior of the water was as if the antibody was still there. Now, if he'd gone out on a street corner and talked to a normal human being about this, he probably would have stopped if he'd been listening, but he didn't. The next thing that he did, which is pretty incredible, is he got this idea published in a reputable scientific journal. The name of this journal is Nature. Nature is published in London every week. It is a solid gold journal. It prides itself on having published some of the great breakthroughs of all time. For example, the Watson and Crick structure of DNA, the double helix, appeared first in Nature, and it goes on from there. So the question is, how on earth did he get it published in Nature? The answer seems to be that he was Dr. Benaviste. He had this tremendous reputation, and that it was that alone that carried him, over the bar and got this published in Nature. Nature had to live this down, let's put it that way. He, in fact, immediately had a number of people who backed him, who thought it was a terrific idea. And I didn't know this until I dug into this. Turns out that fans of homeopathic medicine believe that in many cases, water that has had a drug dissolved in it retains the properties of that drug as a curative long after the drug has been diluted away. And so homeopaths, at least in France, perhaps on the European continent, were very enthusiastic about Benaviste's discovery. The problem was that everybody else, including me, because when I heard about this, and this was about 1995 or so, thought, this is nuts. And what happened was that, of course, when you get a result like this, when it's published in a fancy journal, other scientists are going to take an almost rabid interest in it. And this may be a case where there were a large number, perhaps the largest number of attempts to replicate his result. And when that happened, no one could reproduce the result. I mean, the homeopaths, to this day, are apparently true believers, but nobody else believes for a minute that this is a valid scientific result. So the question is, how did Benaviste come to this? How did he do it? Why did he do it? And the answer has to be either that he had some sort of a contamination in his laboratory, and people visited the lab and looked around and gave it the once over, and it appeared very unlikely that there were any contaminations that could have caused the result. And the only other answer was that he was starting to slip, and in fact, he had faked the data. And this is verified in a sense because following his claims about water memory, he went into what was called digital biology because he believed that water had a digital structure that you could transmit to other water, and it had these structures in it. Well, he lost all of his research support, and in the end, sort of, retired dishonorably, and is now it's now passed away, actually. So this is a case of real science, real scientist, and something that is totally ridiculous. Okay, so for the third case that we want to go into on the science light side, or the fake light side, is the following. And that is the idea that all you need is water and air. And again, this is something, when I first saw it, I couldn't believe it. It was in an American science magazine that comes out weekly. And it popped up again, I think about the middle of the 1900s, the 1900s, maybe on towards 2000. I can't remember the date exactly. But it turned out there's a cult, or there are a group of cults that practice Breatharianism. Okay, so this is a cult whose members, and they are called Breatharianists, embrace a belief that humans can exist on air and water alone. Now, I think all of you in the audience can think about this for a minute. Take a look out the window at the nearest palm tree and figure out that there are organisms that can do this, but they aren't human beings. Okay, so we're not here, no hamburgers, no pie, no nothing, just air and water. And it was prominent in England, and there was also a cult on the west coast of the United States. And what's entertaining here is that, first of all, when pressed to do so, these cult members would never demonstrate their dietary beliefs in public. In other words, they were invited to, sit down in an enclosed area. We'll give you all the water you want. We'll give you all the air you want, and just show us how it goes. And they would never do that. So a bell should go off right there that there's something funny about these people. The second thing, which is very sad in England, in fact, is that it was reported that several cult members starved to death. I've tracked down a couple of them, and they did indeed starve to death trying this diet. So there is a consequence of this. But the people in this particular cult seem to go on and on and on believing this, but never showing anybody how they did it. And in England, the cult fell apart for the following reason, and it's somewhat amusing. The cult itself dissolved after paparazzi photographers, these are the people that hounded Princess Diana, for example, produced photographs of their leader, who's called himself a guru, emerging from a McDonald's in London. And so the faithful, having seen their leader, munching on McDonald's best, Big Macs or whatever, sort of gave up the ghost and dropped the fakery and disappeared. And I thought that was it for Breatharianism, because it was completely silly. It was anti-science. It was fake. But no, in 2017, it turns out a reporter from the East Coast, I think it might have been the Atlantic magazine or something, stumbled across a similar cult out on the West Coast of California. And again, it was the same sort of thing. Well, yes, indeed, we get by on air and water. No, we won't show you how we do it. And she actually tracked down the leader of that cult, who again called himself a guru, and she saw him having a piece of apple pie in a local restaurant. So again, cheating and so forth and so on. So this is just completely crazy stuff. And I don't think Breatharianism, if it's still around, has much of a lifetime left in it, because it completely goes against everything in the case of human nutrition, plant nutrition, in fact, and everything else. So those are three kind of, light takes on fake science. We need to move on now to things that are a bit more serious. So I want to talk about vaccinations and autism. I've talked about this before. I'll talk about it now because it's had consequences since I gave that talk in 2019. About vaccinations, the human race has been vaccinating itself regularly from at least the 1800s on. Edward Jenner started it all with pox vaccinations, Louis Pasteur, and it's been sort of a standard medical procedure. But all the way along, there have always been some groups of people that resist the benefits of vaccination. Sometimes it's a product of religious beliefs. Sometimes it's outright science denial. One way or another, there are always a small group of people that don't want to be vaccinated, and that they have reasons for following this. In spite of that, mass inoculations, as we know, have dramatically reduced or erased incidence of a large number of diseases. Polio, which I remember very well as a kid, the polio vaccine took a tremendous weight off of children in the United States and some adults. Measles vaccine, smallpox, mumps, Ebola, if we ever need it, there's a vaccine for that. And the growth of immunology, the growth of epidemiology is at a point where now we're pretty sure that with COVID-19 vaccinations, this may help to end the current pandemic of the COVID virus. The setback to this is a case of outright fake medicine that happened in the late 1900s. Destroyed the belief of a number of people in the value of vaccinations. The character behind all of this is a doctor named Andrew Wakefield, and he did autism research in quotes. So let's go through this and look at what happened in the case of Wakefield. Here he is. What he did basically was fake medical data in order to link the measles, mumps, rubella, or MMR vaccine with autism. And as a result, and this is not just in the United States, not just in England, but on the European continent and probably elsewhere as well, measles infections have increased dramatically, and a resistance to vaccination has developed. And so we'll talk about this in some detail. All right, so the Wakefield Affair, fake medical data. It started in 1998, toward the end of the 1900s, where Wakefield and a group of colleagues published a paper in the United Kingdom and England claiming that the MMR vaccine actually caused autism in vaccinated children. And this generated immediate widespread concern. First of all, because the paper was published in the best medical journal in England called The Lancet, it was obviously an attention getter. And Wakefield himself sort of became the poster boy for going out and talking about vaccines and about the danger of vaccination in terms of the cause of autism. And what happened, getting ahead of myself a little bit, what happened is that in England, the rate of vaccination overall dropped from 93% to something like 70%, which goes below the herd immunity level. And this is all due to this paper and this particular MD. So this went on for about 3 years, where he was really riding high on this whole thing, and the concept, the idea was spreading because the connection with autism was something that was really loaded emotionally, especially with parents who had autistic children. But the bad news for Wakefield was that the science reporter, the main science reporter for the Times of London, which is a leading newspaper in England, was looking at his data, was trying to talk to people that had been involved in the research and to really nail down whether this research was on the up and up. And in the end, this man, his name is John Deere, and he's received a number of major awards for science reporting in England as a result of this, uncovered the fake data. First of all, there were only 12 children in the study. 12 children, you can't do statistics on 12 children. You can't even get a meaningful study of any sort of biomedical phenomenon with 12 children. Secondly, it turned out that some of the children were supplied by lawyers representing the parents of children that are autistic who were aiming to sue pharmaceutical companies that were making the MMR vaccine. The statistics apparently could have been unearthed and shown to be flawed by a student that had had a good statistics course in high school. And the data was discovered to have been heavily manipulated. In fact, there wasn't much data at all. They couldn't be sure that the data were real. And in the end, the question was actually raised as to whether Wakefield had been involved in a scheme with the lawyers to get this paper out so that they could sue the vaccine manufacturers. And I don't know that that's ever been proven, but a lot of work has gone into trying to stick that one on him as well. So this is pretty massive of and by itself. And in 2004, finally, the medical establishment in England revoked his license to practice medicine in England, and his paper in the Lancet was retracted by the journal itself. The question as to why it would take, 3 years after the fake data were uncovered for the paper to be retracted is probably a case of the journal trying to cover itself in some way or form. After that, things got a bit hot in England for Wakefield. And so he took off and he moved to Texas with his family. And interesting enough, he was supported there in Austin, Texas, by a group of wealthy anti-vaxxers that had established a home for autistic children. And he was put in charge of the autistic children's home. And he managed to do that for about 6 years. In 2010, he finally lost support of these Texans because in England, there are another set of findings that unearthed further fake research and, again, pointed at him. There were really very nasty things said about him in the press, that if he ever got back to England, he should be put on trial and so forth and so on. What he's been doing since 2010, I don't know, but it turns out that he's pretty wealthy. He might be coming from the Texans or came from the Texans. It might be other sources. He's been invited to testify before committees looking at state laws on inoculation as a requirement for attendance at school by children and things like that, and he's always against it. The other thing that he did was in 2016, he produced a movie which he called Vaxxed, and this was almost shown at the Tribeca Film Festival in that year or in 2017. And the person who pushed for it was Robert De Niro, who has an autistic child. And it took all of De Niro's friends some substantial amount of time to convince him that this whole thing was a fake and they should just drop the support and, accept the fact that he has a child with autism. He did. The movie wasn't shown, but in the end, and this is down to the present day, first of all, money that could have gone into research on the causes of autism went to support large-scale studies, statistically significant studies, 500,000, 600,000 children worldwide that show with statistical certainty that there's absolutely no connection between MMR vaccinations and autism. Fine, but the problem is that at the same time, we now have a large anti-vaccination movement that has formed in the United States. These people constitute a real threat to public health in that they are about 9% of the population. That would be not quite 30 million people. These are people that will absolutely not be vaccinated, will not have their children vaccinated, and they are a component of the worry that epidemiologists are facing now as they begin to try and make the calculations about how many vaccines need to get out for COVID-19 in order to get this, what's called the herd immunity, where enough people are immunized so that viral spread is stopped. Because as a secondary effect of Wakefield's work, in addition to the anti-vaxxers, there are as many as 65 million people who are the doubters and what are called the doubters and the laggards now, who are not sure that they want to get the vaccine. They have questions about it, they have concerns about it. They are apparently pliable in the sense that they think that many of these people will decide to get vaccinated, but a fair number of them are going to have to get the American populace in a state of vaccination where they're up to the level of herd immunization. So Wakefield has done a substantial amount of damage single-handedly with fake data. And I think his entire aim was to make money in one way or another, because he certainly has. He's wealthy. He lives in Texas, but he shows up in Florida as well, and leaving Wakefield in the dust. There's a picture of him with his lady friend, the supermodel Ellie McPherson. They hang out in Miami, apparently. This was taken in 2018, but apparently they're still together. And at the same time that they're whooping it up and having a good time, although it's submerged behind the pandemic data, measles infections are still increasing, but not at the rate they were, because children are not being kept out of school and kept out of contact with one another. So that's a positive. A positive effect of the pandemic is that measles infections are down right now, but once the pandemic's over with, who knows? Okay, so an all-around bad guy and a superior data faker. All right, so the last thing to talk about, the last two things to talk about. One is about autism and facilitation and the fake there. Let me explain what this is. I think many of you will remember this. Wakefield's results drew more attention to autistic children, but autistic children were already under consideration by people seeking to find possible means to communicate with the most seriously affected victims. The children that really are it's almost impossible to communicate with. There must have been ways to reach them, people thought, and this led to another problem. Two universities in the United States founded, and this is back, I think, in the 1950s or so, the 1900s, and founded facilitated communication programs that were designed to train people to be able to communicate with severely affected autistic children. And the name facilitated communications was given to, I think, again, 1995, somewhere between 1995 and 2000s, when I remember hearing about this. People in these programs were specially trained, and they were supposedly had the ability to communicate with autistic children by using computer keyboards. And you may have seen this, actually. Procedure attracted many parents. They became staunch supporters of the method as a way to communicate with their children. And so the idea was that a facilitator would interact with the child and with a computer keyboard, and I should have a picture of this here. That hand on the hand of the person pointing at the keyboard is the hand of a facilitator. And the facilitator would guide the hand on the keyboard so that the patient would type out words and in that way communicate. And many parents were hopelessly enslaved by this idea, because suddenly children who they could not communicate with at all were getting in touch with them. They were communicating back and forth. Well, it was a fake. And this is again, a pretty terrible one. Eventually, people that were actually experts in the field of communication and communication data looked at what was happening and felt that there was no possible way that this was happening. And what they did was to construct a series of experiments that showed that the communications by autistic children originated with the facilitator. And the way they did this would be fairly simply to block the facilitator from seeing what the child was seeing. For example, they would put down a ball that the child could see. The facilitator couldn't see the ball. And then the question would be to the child, what are you looking at? And the facilitator was hopeless. They couldn't come up with anything. This was repeated time and time and time and time again. And it was completely clear that facilitation had no way or no role in communication with autistic children. Worse yet, and you can dig this out if you want to, it's all on record. There were numerous allegations of parental abuse of autistic children, and children were taken away from parents. Some parents were put in jail. All of this was shown to be fake accusations by the facilitators, which is, I think, pretty bad. So in the end, today, the 8 or 10 professional societies that deal with communication disorders do not recognize facilitated communication as a legitimate field. They refer to it as a hoax, as a fake. They do everything they can to discourage it. And yet, at least as of yesterday when I looked it up, these 2 US universities are still giving some support to the idea of facilitated communication and the training of facilitators. And in 2018, a person that was doing facilitation was arrested and put in jail for abusing the patient they were working with. So this one is not going away easily when it has been proven to be a total and complete fake. There is a small upside to all of this in the end, and that is that variations of facilitated communication turn out to be useful in some cases in helping other persons that have some neurological disorders to be able to communicate. In other words, just to be able to get them to the keyboard and get them poised so they can actually make some movements toward the keyboard enables communication. It doesn't work for autistic children. All right, so the last one. This goes back a long way. It takes some explaining, but it has got to be one of the biggest fake science cases in the history of modern science. This is communist tweet, a guy named Trofim Lysenko and a guy named Uncle Joe. So let me break you into this. By the 1930s, genetics, the science of genetics, was probably the most firmly established quantitative science in the life sciences. And it had worldwide implications for a number of things, one of the biggest of which was agricultural applications, where by simple crossbreeding of different strains, different varieties of things like corn, soybeans, and what have you, you could get much higher crop yields. And this was a true breakthrough. It brought the United States agriculture, I think, to the front in the world. It made us the best, and I think we probably still are. But the problem was this didn't happen in the Soviet Union. And the whole of genetics and of improved crop yields that was so beneficial to masses, to large numbers of people, just never happened. The 2 people were, first of all, this guy, Trofim Lysenko. Here's one of the pictures of him smiling. But he had a lot of help from someone else, his boss, so to speak, somebody that you should recognize, Joseph Stalin, one of the great tyrants of the 20th century, responsible for the deaths of millions and millions of people. And the Lysenko-Stalin partnership really did super damage to people living behind the Iron Curtain, especially in the Soviet Union. So let me tell you how this happened, because it's quite strange. So genetics and communist doctrine. Lysenko, I guess, knew which side his bread was buttered on, because he came out and said that modern genetics was bourgeois, which was a standard sort of Soviet curse that was put on anything from capitalist countries. And Lysenko formulated a communist version of genetics that Stalin really liked. Now, Lysenko was an agronomist. He knew agriculture. Stalin liked anything that might make agriculture better, because he had a really rough go of it from the 1930s through the 1940s, because he was responsible for the disruption of the agricultural system, moving the farmers off of their farms onto communes, mass starvation in the Ukraine. Wheat crops failed because the farmers weren't farming, and wheat was moved from the Ukraine to the Soviet Union to Russia to feed the people there, and he had a mess on his hands. And the idea that there was some way that you could fix agriculture with modern genetics, the Lysenko style, really appealed to him. His genetics. Okay, it's pretty simple. Put in a few words, Lysenkian genetics says that newly acquired traits are inherited. That is, in the life cycle of an organism, a trait that organism inherits or picks up can be inherited and passed on to the next generation. I asked a colleague of mine once if there was a really simple definition of Lysenkian genetics, and he said, yeah, it's simple. If you cut off rats' tails, then the next offspring of these rats will have no tails, which, of course, is nonsense. In fact, everybody outside of the Soviet Union knew this was nonsense. It was absolutely crazy. And yet, Lysenko was appointed to probably one of the highest ranking chairs in the Soviet Union, running agricultural research, agriculture, and many other aspects of the life sciences. So he decided that he would tackle in Soviet agriculture the conversion of winter wheat into spring wheat. Well, what happens, his idea was that, okay, if I take winter wheat and plant it in the spring and it does all right, then that spring wheat will be used and we can get 2 crops and on and on and on. This completely damaged wheat yields, and it resulted in mass starvation and a large number of deaths in the Soviet Union. His ideas were later taken up by Mao in China, and there was a huge Chinese famine that killed a number of people also, and yet he went merrily along. What's worse is that he had control over Russian biology, and anybody who criticized him was put in prison. This was Stalin. In some cases, these people were executed. So a whole generation of modern science in the Soviet Union was eradicated, and science in the life sciences was left in Lysenko's crackpot hands. And I think he went on into the 1960s and retarded life sciences research in Russia and the Eastern Bloc until after World War II. In fact, I remember as a student at Iowa State University that I saw Nikita Khrushchev. He showed up there in the 1960s, and the reason he was at Iowa State was because it had a very powerful ag school, and he was there to try and find out what he could do to fix Soviet agriculture, because they were in deep, deep trouble. Lysenko was still knocking around. So I think one of the things that they told Khrushchev when he was in the United States, he talked to a farmer named Roswell Garst, who lived near the Iowa State campus, and the guy was down to earth and he really knew agriculture. I think he probably told Khrushchev to fire Lysenko, because they did. Took him out of his positions, got him out of the Soviet research apparatus, but the damage that he did is horrible. He died in 1976, but his ideas apparently are still recirculating in the Putin regime. I just read a comment by one of Putin's advisors that Lysenko may not have been such a bad guy, that he has some very interesting ideas. And I thought, here we go again. The net effect of Lysenko was when when the Iron Curtain collapsed, when everything fell apart, and we had contact with our colleagues in Russia, especially, they were hopelessly behind in almost all areas of research in the life sciences. In physics and in math, they were really good. In the life sciences, they're still struggling, I think, to get up to where they should be. Okay, so that's what I have to say about fake science with these examples. You can see in all cases that you can get a couple of individuals, one individual, whatever, that can start an idea, it spreads around, or it can be forced on a population by somebody like Joe Stalin, and you can get into real consequences with large populations of people.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll go
Concluding
ahead. Oh, you have concluding thoughts. I'm so sorry. I was going to open it to questions.
You know, why does fake science get into the system rather than the real thing? Well, okay. There was always common sense, but common sense is really taxed pretty heavily these days because there are all kinds of things coming at us from all sides. There's the internet, and the internet is great. There's a lot of truth on the internet, but there are studies, quantitative studies, that show that lies spread faster than the truth on the internet. And so people that use the internet as a source are liable to trip over fake science at some point, and they may be overwhelmed by it because of the spread. Bad science in the public eye. Honestly, if you have people like Benaviste and Wakefield and Lysenko, forget Lysenko, that was a long time ago, but Wakefield's recent, Benaviste's recent. If the public sees this and they're thinking, wait a minute, you know, you've got these guys in their white coats and they're doing this stuff that isn't so good. What are we supposed to make of other people that are, you know, doing science? So that the level of critical perception may be affected by this sort of thing. Another thing is that, face it, technology is really complicated now, and it's in many cases it's very difficult to comprehend. And so you can't expect the person that is very well educated in a non-scientific field to immediately grasp why you can use an mRNA, for example, to make a vaccine. Resistance to vaccination and mask wearing is another issue. One of the things that I think is interesting here that a medical colleague of mine told me is that a lot of the population in the United States today never experienced a pandemic or an epidemic. I mean, people our age remember the polio epidemic, for example, and remember that vaccination was really, you know, a savior for us. But what about people that are much younger, that have never been through anything like this? Why should they just take at face value that vaccinations and mask wearing are beneficial? There are also polls out there that are pretty discouraging because they indicate that a lot of people now think that they know more than the medical community and scientists know. That may in part have something to do with the bad science phenomenon. It may also be that people just, you know, working on their own come to conclusions that may not be correct. So can you detect fake science? I wish I could answer that. I'm not sure that you can. You can always look at the source of information and the qualifications, but again, you're always confronted with these situations, excuse me, where, for example, you had two people, both MDs, one saying don't wear masks, one saying wear masks. One's Anthony Fauci, and he's an epidemiologist, and he knows what he's talking about, and the other is Scott Atlas, and he is a neuroradiologist. He's an MD. That sounds pretty impressive. You got to go digging in the weeds to find out that neuroradiologists look at x-rays of the nervous system. They don't really have anything to do with disease to know that maybe Anthony Fauci is the person you should be listening to. And then, you know, where do you hear about these things? Again, you go back to the internet, and the spread of misinformation is like the spread of the virus. I mean, the internet does its part, Twitter, and various other social media resources also. You can always ask the question if it would pass a reality check, but then you have to put yourself in the spot of being the one who sets the bar for reality, and that's an unfair standard for many people in the American public today. You can also give it the Snopes test. Snopes.com is a fact-checking site. They're usually overwhelmed with conspiracy theories, but they also do have a site, for example, that deals with COVID-19. And they have gone into other kinds of fake science and rooted out what was real and what wasn't real. So I conclude with Mark Twain, what you want to remember is that it's what you know for sure that just ain't so sometimes, and that would be fake science. And now, Aga, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yes, if you're interested in asking a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I am going to launch a poll, as I mentioned before to you. We're asking you to fill a couple questions so we have an idea of how we did during this presentation. That helps us immensely. Do we have anyone raising hand? Anybody would like to share a comment or a thought? We have one raised hand. Mr. McDowell, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself? Go ahead.
How do you evaluate things that come forward from reputable sources but are not within an individual's field? I know you just used the example of the of two physicians, but for instance, let's say that something comes back from this Mars exploration that's landing today, and they determine that there are molecules or that there are remainderments of life, and somebody goes ahead and hypothesizes what it is, and the thing grows like topsy. How do you in this day and age, with tremendous amounts of communications, both good and bad, how do you determine that for yourself when the average person doesn't even know what is being hypothesized? It's not a good
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that.
I mean, you can do it when you're physically proximate to something, but if it's hypothesized that life existed on Mars and science or fake science is used to prove that, how do you determine that that is not the case when you don't have the facility to actually do the examinations? Or how do you do that?
You have to take it at face value. If, for example, let's say that NASA gives you all the information and all the analytical instrumentation that was used to detect what we're talking about here as a life molecule, and that instrumentation all would fit my my rules for what you would have to make an accurate determination that that was exactly the molecule they said it was. That would open the door to believing what they said, if it were a molecule that was something that was commonly associated with life, glucose, for example. Otherwise, I'd be a little bit skeptical.
Do we have any other raised hands? Mr. Joachim, thank you so much for presenting today. This was a fascinating topic. We are looking forward to more presentations done by you. Ladies and gentlemen, please go ahead and fill the polling question if you don't mind. And at this point, we are going to be ending our session on the Guide to Fake Science. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating.